The jarring shriek of a power drill ripped through the quiet morning air, dragging Michael from a fitful sleep. He winced, the sound vibrating through his bones, a brutal intrusion on the peaceful Saturday he desperately craved. What was that? He struggled to sit up in bed, the familiar ache in his legs, a constant reminder of the accident that had changed his life forever.
Welcome to Karen Chronicles. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue creating even better content. Thank you so much. All right, let's get started.
He maneuvered himself into his wheelchair, the smooth, well-worn wood of the ramp leading from his bedroom to the front door, a testament to his hard-won independence. But as he reached the door and peered through the window, his heart sank. His stomach churned with a mixture of disbelief and rage. There in his front yard, amidst a cloud of dust and flying debris, stood Karen, and she was destroying his ramp. Not just any ramp. This was a custom-built, ADA-compliant ramp, meticulously designed and installed to meet his specific needs. It was his lifeline, his connection to the outside world, a $15,000 investment in his freedom. And Karen, the HOA president, the self-proclaimed arbiter of taste and aesthetics, was systematically dismantling it with a rented jackhammer. "What the hell are you doing?" Michael shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of pain and fury. He wheeled himself outside, the uneven ground jolting his body. Karen, dressed in her usual power casual attire, a pastel-colored tracksuit and pristine white sneakers, barely glanced at him. She continued her assault on the ramp, the jackhammer roaring like a monstrous beast. This I saw," she finally said, gesturing vaguely at the ramp with a dismissive wave of her hand, "is in violation of HOA guidelines. It doesn't conform to the community's aesthetic standards." Michael was speechless for a moment, his mind struggling to comprehend the sheer audacity of her actions. "Aesthetic standards?" he finally sputtered. "This is an ADA-required ramp. It's legally required. I have all the permits. You can't just—" Karen cut him off with a cold, condescending smile. "Oh, I can, and I have. You should have read the bylaws, Mr. Davis. Section 4, subsection B clearly states—" She rattled off some obscure clause about exterior modifications requiring HOA approval, her voice dripping with self-righteousness. But I did get approval," Michael protested, his voice rising in desperation. "I submitted all the plans. Everything. You signed off on it yourself." Karen shrugged, her expression unyielding. "Well, I've changed my mind. It doesn't look right. Too modern. It clashes with the traditional architecture of the neighborhood." She gestured vaguely at the rows of identical cookie-cutter houses lining the street. Then, to add insult to injury, she held out a piece of paper. "This is a violation notice. You'll need to pay a $500 fee to apply for permission to rebuild the ramp. Of course, there's no guarantee it will be approved this time." The sheer cruelty of it took Michael's breath away. She was destroying his property, violating his rights, and then demanding that he pay for the privilege of potentially rebuilding it. The injustice wasn't limited to Michael. Whispers of Karen's other tyrannical acts had been circulating through the neighborhood for months. Mrs. Rodriguez, a sweet, elderly woman with a passion for gardening, had been forced to rip out her beloved rose bushes because they were deemed too colorful. Little Timmy Johnson, a 7-year-old with boundless energy, had been banned from leaving his bicycle in his own front yard because it was unsightly. The list went on, a litany of petty grievances and arbitrary rules enforced with an iron fist. As Michael stared at the shattered remains of his ramp, a symbol of his independence now reduced to rubble, he felt a surge of anger, not just for himself, but for all his neighbors who had suffered under Karen's reign. This wasn't just about a ramp, it was about basic human decency, about respect, about the right to live in peace and dignity. And he was done being silent. This was war. The roar of the jackhammer may have stopped, but the fire it ignited in Michael burned brighter than ever. As Karen drove away, leaving behind a trail of dust and destruction, Michael wasn't defeated. He was galvanized. He wouldn't let her get away with this. He would fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had been bullied and intimidated by her reign of terror. His first act was to document everything. He wheeled himself around the wreckage, his phone camera clicking furiously. He took close-up shots of the shattered concrete, the twisted metal, the gaping hole where his ramp once stood. He captured the violation notice, Karen's smug signature scrawled across the bottom. He recorded a video, his voice shaking with anger and disbelief, narrating the scene, the injustice, the blatant disregard for his rights. Then, he turned his attention to the legal front. He meticulously gathered all the documents related to his ramp, the original plans, the permits he'd obtained, the HOA's initial approval, the one Karen had conveniently forgotten, and every communication he'd had with them. He organized everything, creating a digital file and a physical folder, building his case like a seasoned lawyer preparing for trial. He wasn't alone in this fight. The news of Karen's latest outrage spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Neighbors, emboldened by Michael's defiance, started to come forward. They brought their own stories, their own evidence of Karen's misdeeds. Mrs. Rodriguez, her eyes still stinging from the loss of her roses, provided photos of the HOA approved. The flower guidelines, a document so restrictive it practically banned anything that wasn't beige. Timmy Johnson's parents shared videos of Karen scolding their son for riding his bike, her voice shrill and accusatory. Others offered their skills. A retired accountant volunteered to audit the HOA's finances, suspecting, correctly as it turned, that Karen had been using the association's funds for personal gain. A tech-savvy teenager set up a secure online forum where residents could anonymously share information and coordinate their efforts. Michael's next call was to his lawyer, a sharp, tenacious attorney named Sarah Chen. He laid out the facts, his voice calm and controlled, the underlying anger carefully contained. Sarah listened intently, her expression hardening with each new detail. "This is outrageous, Michael," she said when he'd finished. "She's violated the ADA. She's violated your property rights. She's probably violated a dozen other laws I can think of. We're going to sue her, and we're going to win." But Michael wasn't just interested in legal recourse. He wanted to expose Karen's behavior, to shine a light on the injustice that had been festering in their community for far too long. He contacted the local news station, sending them the video he'd recorded, along with copies of the violation, notices and other evidence. He knew that public pressure could be a powerful weapon, and he intended to use it. He spent the next few days meticulously gathering evidence, coordinating with his neighbors, and preparing for the battle ahead. He was exhausted, his body aching from the stress and the physical strain of navigating his home without his ramp. But he was also energized. He had a purpose, a mission, and he wouldn't rest until justice was served. Karen had picked the wrong fight with the wrong man in the wrong neighborhood. She was about to learn that even the most seemingly powerless individuals, when united by a common cause, could be a force to be reckoned with. The air in the community center was thick with tension. Karen, standing at the podium, radiated her usual air of smug self-assurance. She'd called an emergency HOA meeting, ostensibly to discuss recent concerns regarding unauthorized modifications to property. Everyone knew, of course, that this was code for Karen's latest attempt to justify her tyrannical behavior. On the projector screen behind her, a distorted image flickered, a photo of Michael's now demolished ramp, taken at an unflattering angle to make it appear larger and more intrusive than it actually was. "As you can see," Karen began, her voice dripping with condescension, Mr. Davis has flagrantly violated HOA guidelines by installing this monstrosity without proper authorization. She tapped the screen with her laser pointer, emphasizing the supposed ugliness of the ramp. It's a clear violation of our community's aesthetic standards, and it sets a dangerous precedent. She launched into a prepared speech, a carefully crafted narrative designed to paint Michael as a reckless scofflaw and herself as the valiant defender of the neighborhood's character. She cited obscure clauses in the HOA bylaws, twisted facts, and omitted crucial details. She even had the audacity to claim that the ramp posed a safety hazard, despite it being built to strict ADA specifications. Michael sat quietly, listening to her lies, his hands clenched into fists. He'd anticipated this. He'd prepared for it. He'd come armed with the truth, and he was ready to unleash it. When Karen finally finished her self-serving monologue, she opened the floor for questions. A few timid hands went up, but Karen quickly dismissed them, clearly preferring to control the narrative. That's when Michael stood up. "Karen," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you've made a lot of accusations. Now I'd like to present some facts." He walked to the front of the room, his wheelchair humming softly. He connected his laptop to the projector, and the image of Karen's distorted photo was replaced by a clear, detailed blueprint of his ramp, complete with all the necessary permits and approvals. "This," he said, "is the ramp that Karen destroyed. It was designed and built to meet all ADA requirements. It was approved by the city and initially by the HOA itself." He displayed the original approval document, Karen's signature clearly visible at the bottom. Karen sputtered, trying to interrupt, but Michael continued, his voice gaining strength. He systematically dismantled her arguments point by point, exposing her lies and distortions with cold, hard facts. He showed the video of Karen destroying the ramp, the sound of the jackhammer echoing through the room. He presented the violation notice, demanding $500 for permission to rebuild what she had illegally demolished. Then, he dropped the bombshell. "Many of you may not know this," he said, "but 5 years ago, this HOA was on the brink of bankruptcy. Our community was facing foreclosure. A generous anonymous donor stepped in and contributed $155,000 to save us." He paused, letting the information sink in. "That donor was me." A collective gasp swept through the room. Karen's face turned ashen. Michael continued, "And I have reason to believe, and produce the document, that Ms. Thompson here has been systematically embezzling those funds, using them for her own personal gain." He displayed bank statements, receipts, and other financial records that his neighbor, the retired accountant, had painstakingly uncovered. The dam had broken. The room erupted in a chorus of angry voices. Neighbors, emboldened by Michael's revelations and fueled by their own pent-up frustrations, began to speak out. Mrs. Rodriguez recounted the story of her roses. Timmy Johnson's parents described Karen's harassment of their son. Others shared similar tales of petty tyranny and abuse of power. Karen, cornered and exposed, tried to defend herself, but her voice was drowned out by the rising tide of outrage. Her reign of terror was over. The community she had sought to control had finally turned against her. The community meeting had devolved into a full-blown revolt. The air crackled with years of pent-up resentment, now unleashed in a torrent of accusations and revelations. Karen, once the undisputed ruler of their suburban domain, stood pale and trembling, her carefully constructed facade crumbling before her eyes. Then Mr. Johnson, Timmy's father, a quiet man who usually kept to himself, stood up. "I have something to show everyone," he announced, his voice trembling slightly but firm with resolve. He held up his phone. "I caught this on my security camera a few weeks ago." He connected his phone to the projector, and a video flickered onto the screen. It showed Karen standing in her driveway, talking to a man in a contractor's uniform. The man handed her a thick, white envelope. Karen glanced around furtively, then quickly stuffed the envelope into her purse. The video ended with Karen giving the contractor a knowing nod and a smile. A collective gasp went through the room. Even those who had already turned against Karen were shocked by the brazenness of the act. "That's Bob Miller," someone shouted. "He built that hideous addition on his house last year, the one that blocks everyone's view. He got approved in a week," another voice added. "I submitted plans for a deck 6 months ago, and Karen's still reviewing them." The floodgates opened. One by one, residents stood up and shared their own stories of Karen's blatant favoritism. She had approved her friends' extravagant renovations, while rejecting similar requests from others based on flimsy subjective criteria. She had fast-tracked permits for her cronies, while leaving everyone else languishing in bureaucratic limbo. Then, Mr. Rodriguez, the HOA treasurer, a meticulous, detail-oriented man who had served on the board for years, cleared his throat. "I have something to add," he said, his voice shaking with indignation. He pulled out a thick folder filled with documents. "I've been reviewing the HOA's financial records, and I've discovered some irregularities." He proceeded to outline a series of suspicious transactions, all authorized by Karen. There were payments to landscaping companies that had never performed any work in the common areas, invoices for consulting fees to companies that didn't seem to exist, and most damningly, a large payment to a construction company for sidewalk repairs. "The interesting thing about these sidewalk repairs," Mr. Rodriguez said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "is that they were done exclusively on Karen's property. She used HOA funds to build herself a brand new custom-designed walkway, while the rest of us have to navigate cracked and crumbling sidewalks." Karen, now completely cornered, lashed out. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked. "I know things. I know secrets about all of you." She turned to Michael, her eyes filled with venom. "You think you're so smart, Mr. Davis. I know about..." Before she could finish her threat, Mrs. Rodriguez stood up, her voice shaking but resolute. "Karen," she said, her voice filled with a quiet dignity that silenced the room, "you've bullied us for long enough. You've abused your power, you've stolen from us, and you've treated us with contempt. It's over, just stop." The weight of Mrs. Rodriguez's words, simple yet powerful, hung in the air. Karen deflated, the fight draining from her. The threat, whatever it was, died on her lips. She had nothing left. Her reign of terror was over. The air in the community center, once thick with tension and fear, now crackled with a different kind of energy, the energy of liberation. The time for whispers and hushed complaints was over. The time for action had arrived. "I move that we hold a vote of no confidence in Karen Thompson as president of the HOA," Mr. Henderson declared, his voice surprisingly strong despite his age. "Second," came a chorus of voices from around the room. It wasn't even a formal procedure outlined in the bylaws. It was a spontaneous uprising, a collective rejection of tyranny. Michael, watching from the sidelines, felt a surge of pride in his neighbors. They had found their courage, their voice, their power. Someone produced a makeshift ballot box, a cardboard box that had once held Karen's endless supply of violation notices. Slips of paper were quickly distributed, and residents lined up to cast their votes, their faces grim but determined. The counting was swift and decisive. The result was unanimous. Every single vote, except for Karen's own, was against her. She was out, ousted, deposed. A wave of applause and cheers erupted in the room. People hugged, shook hands, and even shed tears of relief. The nightmare was over. The next step was accountability. The residents, guided by Sarah Chen, Michael's lawyer, who had arrived at the meeting just as the vote was taking place, organized a class action lawsuit against Karen. They demanded the return of the embezzled funds, compensation for damages, and a full accounting of her financial misdeeds. Karen, stripped of her power and facing legal ruin, tried one last desperate tactic. She attempted to intimidate, to threaten, to remind people of the secrets she supposedly held. But her threats fell on deaf ears. No one was afraid of her anymore. Her reign of terror had relied on fear and isolation, and now that the community had united, her power had vanished. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. I'll ruin you all." But no one responded. They simply looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. She was a pathetic figure, a bully stripped bare, a tyrant overthrown. Finally, realizing that she was defeated, Karen broke down. She signed the resignation papers, her hand trembling so violently that her signature was barely legible. The HOA, the organization she had used as her personal fiefdom, was now free of her grasp. A new board was elected, a diverse group of residents committed to fairness, transparency, and community. The era of Karen was over. A new era, an era of hope and cooperation, had begun. The first sign of the neighborhood's rebirth was the rebuilding of Michael's ramp. But this time, it wasn't just a replacement, it was an improvement. Neighbors volunteered their time and skills. A local contractor who had previously been blacklisted by Karen for refusing to pay her kickbacks offered his services at a discounted rate. The new ramp was wider, stronger, and more aesthetically pleasing than the original. It even featured solar-powered lights, illuminating the path at night, a symbol of the neighborhood's newfound brightness. The new HOA board, led by the calm and reasonable Mrs. Rodriguez, immediately set about reforming the association's operations. Transparency was their guiding principle. All financial records were made public, and meetings were open to all residents. The focus shifted from enforcing petty rules to fostering a sense of community. The HOA funds, once squandered on Karen's personal whims, were now used for genuine improvements, repairing the cracked sidewalks, planting trees, and organizing community events. They even established a small fund to help residents facing financial hardship, a stark contrast to Karen's predatory fines. The change in atmosphere was palpable. People started smiling at each other again, stopping to chat on the street, offering to help with groceries or yard work. Barbecues and potlucks became regular occurrences. The fear and suspicion that had permeated the neighborhood under Karen's rule were replaced by a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose. Karen, surprisingly, remained in the neighborhood. Perhaps she couldn't afford to move, or perhaps she was simply too stubborn to admit defeat. But her life was drastically different. She was now just another resident, subject to the same rules and regulations that she had once so ruthlessly enforced. She had to submit requests for any home improvements, keep her lawn meticulously trimmed, and ironically, park her car within the designated spaces. She was a pariah, a constant reminder of the dark days of the HOA tyranny. People avoided her, crossing the street when they saw her coming. She no longer held court at the community center, no longer wielded the power of the violation notice, no longer instilled fear in the hearts of her neighbors. She was just Karen, a lonely, bitter woman living in a community that had moved on without her. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, of course. There were still disagreements, still occasional conflicts, but now they were resolved through dialogue, compromise, and a shared commitment to fairness. The experience with Karen had been a painful but ultimately valuable lesson. It had forged a stronger, more resilient, and more united community. They had faced down tyranny and won, and in doing so, they had discovered the true meaning of neighborly love. And they made sure that HOA will never be corrupted again. This second tale of Karen and the HOA while echoing the themes of the first, delves deeper into the corrosive effects of unchecked power and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit when faced with injustice. It offers a potent reminder that vigilance, courage, and community are not just abstract ideals, but essential ingredients for a fulfilling and just life, particularly as we navigate our later years. One of the most powerful lessons is the danger of apathy. Karen's reign of terror didn't begin overnight. It was a gradual erosion of rights, fueled by the silence and inaction of those who felt powerless to stop her. This speaks to a broader truth. Injustice thrives when good people remain silent. As we age, we often accumulate a wealth of experience and wisdom. We've seen firsthand the consequences of unchecked power, both in our personal lives and in the wider world. It's our responsibility, therefore, to use that wisdom to speak out against wrongdoing, even when it seems inconvenient or uncomfortable. Our voices, seasoned by time, carry weight and can inspire others to act. The story also highlights the transformative power of collective action. Michael, on his own, was vulnerable, but when he connected with his neighbors, when they shared their stories and united their efforts, they became an unstoppable force. This underscores the enduring importance of community, especially as we age. Loneliness and isolation can be significant challenges in later life, but strong community bonds provide support, companionship, and a sense of belonging. Participating in local groups, volunteering, or simply reaching out to neighbors can make a profound difference, both in our own lives and in the lives of others. Furthermore, this narrative emphasizes that true justice is restorative, not punitive. While Karen faced consequences for her actions, the ultimate victory wasn't about her punishment. It was about the healing and rebuilding of the community. The new HOA focused on transparency, fairness, and helping those in need. This is a powerful reminder that true justice seeks to repair harm, not simply to inflict pain. In our own lives, this means focusing on forgiveness, reconciliation, and building bridges, rather than holding on to grudges and seeking revenge. Finally, the story subtly touches upon the importance of respecting the rights of all, including those with disabilities. Karen's destruction of Michael's ramp was not just an act of malice, it was a violation of his fundamental right to access and independence. As we age, many of us may experience physical limitations or disabilities. This story reminds us to be mindful of the needs of others, to advocate for accessibility and inclusion, and to treat everyone with dignity and respect. Building a society that truly values its elders means ensuring that everyone, regardless of their physical abilities, can participate fully in community life. It is not about charity, but about creating a society that truly embraces the values it professes.